Welcome to Tech Support, a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ, where we encourage and equip people to interact with the biblical text. We are your hosts, Tim Martin and Brian Lemaster.
This is episode 3 of the New Testament World. If this is your first week with us, welcome. I encourage you to go ahead and backtrack to the beginning of this series. I think it'll be helpful to you. Or you can go ahead and jump into this episode here and just go back and listen to the other 2 episodes. We're spending 3 weeks here looking at the New Testament world, different elements of what that looks like. This is important as we think about our own study and coming to understand that original message that was sent to the original audience of things that are just different from their culture to our culture, and not just to take stuff that we know today and just throw it back onto the text thinking it's one and the same. So, Tim, as we jump into this week we are going to look at the home. And before we kind of jump into individual homes, we wanted to start with the overall social structure and understanding kind of how that world was different from ours and maybe even some similarities. Help us out. What did that social structure look like?
Much different than our own, but some of the principles we might be able to think about. We do have a social structure in our society, but in our American society, I guess I should say, we would have ultra wealthy people. Then we have something they really didn't have, which is a wide range of middle class, and then we may have lower middle class, and then we may have poor, and then just people who are absolutely destitute. But with them, a social structure is pretty rigid. These things were really, really highly concentrated, wealthy people. Patricians is what I would call them. And I may not even be pronouncing that word right, but that's how I've always pronounced it. But we're talking about senatorial, imperial class people that might be high political leaders in the Roman Empire.
The 1%.
The 1% or less,
today,
or even maybe less than that. Maybe that would be in that class of people, may even be like less than 1% of people, because there are class underneath them, we might say, of like an equestrian class. Still wealthy. I've seen that compared maybe to a medieval knight, someone that had property, a pretty large estate, money, maybe servants or slaves. And so the key things are, what are you born into? What's your family? There's not really where we would talk about a glass ceiling, maybe in our society. This is a concrete ceiling. Jesus was never going to be a Roman senator. Obviously, I say that tongue in cheek because he would never aspire to. But somebody born into his class was not going to be a Roman senator or even a Roman governor or anything like that day and time. The best they could do is maybe join the military and rise up to a centurion level.
Why was there such a concrete ceiling there?
I don't know if there's, let's say why, but based on what little I do know is that it was just very well controlled on who went into those classes. A lot of it's going to depend on education availability, the inheritance of property and owning property, and slaves, and the wealth that was involved was just not disseminated. It was not a trickle-down economy, if you will. So I think it was just fixed in that way. But you think about it, we don't even have to go back very far into our own Western European history to get to that same type of thing, or even in our own colonial history. The generals in our army in the Revolutionary War were not born poor for the most part. They were all wealthy, educated people who could read and write and knew things that most people didn't know, that were just labor.
Yeah, I assume when we think about education, there's almost in our country we want to give everybody an equal opportunity for knowledge. And if that's not there, if the building blocks to equal out people or to raise up's not there, then it's impossible to jump that class.
That's right.
Even if people aren't trying to control it, which they were. So, but
what we think about, and we'll talk about this maybe with children a little bit. We think about, everybody can get a K through 12 education. They couldn't in that day and time. Only the wealthy people went off to some sort of school to get educated. I think Paul was somebody probably like that. I think Paul was a well-educated individual from probably a pretty decent family as far as wealth. But it wasn't that. Not everybody got the same springboard of reading, writing, arithmetic to be able to say, okay, I can at least do this because I have a high school level education and I can read and I can write. I can do some basic math skills. Maybe I can speak. Maybe I can, read at a higher level. That wasn't necessarily, or was not even necessarily, was not as widespread as we may think. Most people got an education by learning what they had to do around the house, take care of animals, take care of food, gardens, crops, and learn to do what daddy did. And then you would just do what daddy did. So
Yeah.
There's not even an expectation. I don't want us to think about, even when we talk about roles in the family or anything, that people felt like they were being oppressed. This is just what they knew. And it was just the way that life was in looking through that. And so some of those things, we get down, you really have this very, very strong concentration. Then you have like this plebeian group of people, which was everybody else, what we might call poor. I've chosen lately to call that common rather than poor, because there were people in that society who did not even have enough to eat every day and wondered about that and begged for food, like Jesus encounters a lot of people. That's poor. Everybody else just kind of a subsistence level living across the board, just, whatever they could get by with every day, and thinking through that. And so freeborn poor persons, freeborn, common type folks, you would have slaves, and then freed slaves, freed persons who may actually come out of slavery at a higher economic status than they went into slavery. Some people sold their children into slavery because they might be better off of doing it. Some people sold their children into slavery to get money. And so very, very concrete social structure, and very challenging for any kind of upward mobility. Like I said, most time it may be the best way to be upward mobility would be military service or becoming a slave of a higher class individual and coming out as part of his household as a freed person.
All right. So with that in mind, and I know it may differ based on the class or the status or rank of the house that we're talking about here, but walk us through kind of what did the home structure look like?
Yeah. I should have said this at the beginning too. Our sources are limited. We often think we've got just this gigantic wealth of resources about the ancient world. Even in Roman history, people like Suetonius or Livy or Dio Cassius or Tacitus, people who wrote, we don't have any of their writings that are much older than about 1,000 years ago, so they're very late, and they're very fragmentary. We're missing large portions of them, and so we don't want to say anything assertive about the ancient world, but one of the things is most of what we have written is written by wealthier individuals. So most of the perspective we have is from wealthier households. And so the wealthier household would have multiple rooms, maybe a courtyard, maybe a garden inside, maybe a slave's quarters, maybe places for different people, for women, for the men. I've understood that houses weren't really divided up gender-based, but more of social class-based, meaning like slaves or freed persons living in households. Some people had very large estates. Most of the common people had generally like a 1 or 2 room house with a outside exterior stair that went up to a roof. We think about the story of Jesus healing the paralytic man as they dig through the roof and they lower him down. I said this in a class a few days ago. If I was the homeowner, I'd be like, "Oh, when you boys plan on fixing my roof?
Yeah.
Now that you can walk again, why don't you get up there and get some mud on the roof?" And thinking through that. But a home would, for wealthier people, there may be a lot of people living there. You may have not only your nuclear family, like your wife and your children, you may also have your extended family, maybe grandparents, maybe brothers and sisters even, or definitely your children may live there. Even your adult children may still live under your roof. Even adult married children still kind of fell under the authority in some Roman households with the paterfamilias, the head of the household.
Do you think that was purely a money decision?
No, I think you were still in Roman society, and we'll talk about that in just a second, that we don't want to paint a broad paintbrush across all the Roman world. They were still under his authority, and maybe it's an economical issue, a pragmatic thing. We're like, hey, everybody can live here, everybody can contribute. I've got space to do that. But also I think a prestige type thing, not just convenience, I guess. We think about, we get married, we move out of mom and dad's house.
I asked that because that's foreign, because we're like...
The idea of just going and being able to do what you want to do, and I know people say, well, the Bible says man shall leave his father and mother. I understand that, but the Romans didn't care what the Bible said. And so their society is not based upon what the Bible teaches. And so that their houses being like that, you may have slaves that live there. You may have freed persons that used to be your slaves. You've now freed them. They maintain a client-patron relationship with you that we've talked about in previous episodes. They may still live there because even though they're freed as slaves, they may not have the economic resources to just, I'm going to go get my own place now. Well, maybe they don't. Maybe they have to live there in your household. So some of them could have been very extensive. We see that like with Cornelius. He and his household were baptized. That probably meant his wife, his children, his slaves. There could have been a lot of servants, and we might call them, be baptized. And so we see Lydia's household, for example. So we see the word household, we need to understand that may just not be 3 or 4 people. And even if it's just a nuclear family, it may be 7, 8, 9, 10 people. But for wealthier people, it may have been more extensive than just a few people. And homes were, sometimes there's apartment style living. If you look at some of these pictures of ruins, some of the housing areas look like a checkerboard, where there may be shared walls, where you may have essentially houses that are built and share a common wall with each other, or they may be 2 stories. I don't think much higher than 2 or 3 stories in that day with the building materials and technology they had, but you still may have a communal type living space that many people are sharing common walls and maybe even sharing a common building in urban areas, versus where you go out in more rural areas, like maybe where Jesus was from. You may have just a single room home, very simple, have a hearth in there for cooking and preparing things, and then animals right out in the courtyard, or a small garden or something that you got things out of. And then, like I said, a roof. We see Peter up on the roof of Simon the tanner's house when he gets his vision about the animals being lowered. So a little bit different. We would think they were living in poverty. Most of the common people we would look at and think, oh, they're living in the studio apartments of the world. But I don't know that they would have viewed themselves in that way. They probably would have been thankful to have some piece of property.
Yeah. And I mean, that would be a similar if you travel different places in the world. A similar
today,
thing. Yeah,
today.
like
We are a very small segment of society, man. We're the 3rd most populous country, but we're in 3rd by a long way away when we think about societies like India, where people are crowded into small
especially
spaces,
when it comes to housing.
And things like that, and where people are shoulder to shoulder. Housing would have been you don't have 4,000 square foot homes unless you've got a lot of money. Just because in an urban area, especially because it's owning that much property. And so it tells us also why people would want to hold on to their property, how important inheritance was, and that, because giving that up would be like, it's not just, well, I think I'll go buy another house. I'm going to go house shopping today. I would say houses probably stayed in for generation after generation.
Tim, if I knew which button it would be, I would push the wedding bells on this soundboard here to cue up our next section here.
Don't push any buttons.
When we think of marriage at that time, I'm going to assume that this is going to be a little different than how we understand marriage in our day and age today, and when people dream of marriage and what all that looks like. Walk us through how they viewed marriage maybe first before we talk about all the other details with it. Like,
I think everything in their life was way more practical and pragmatic than things are for us today. There was kind of just a purpose behind things, and things weren't, I don't know that romantic love was the driver of marriage. I don't think Joseph and Mary drove around to the drive-in and then got some hamburger and fries and stared into each other's eyes and talked about how much they loved each other. It very well may be that Mary's parents and Joseph's parents decided Mary and Joseph will get married. And I think you have some study to this that you're going to talk about here in a few minutes. Things were changing a little bit in Jesus' day and time. I don't want us to think that marriage was just absolutely dry and just a business arrangement. I think there was a friendship and a love and a developing kinship with the spouse, but just a bit more practical and much earlier in life than what we would think would be acceptable, and probably sometimes some great disparity or in ages between when a woman might get married. Today we would lock people up in jail for having sexual relationships with someone in their mid-teens. And
some of the things that I saw was that you're looking at women in their early teens. Mm-hmm. For Greeks, you're looking at a man in his 30s. Mm-hmm. You know, like now whether or not that was his first wife or second wife due to a loss in childbirth, you know, like I don't know all the details there. But one thing that I came across that I thought was interesting was one of the sources that I had actually talked about that for Jews, they actually married younger men wives, that it was closer maybe to like 18, that ballpark, as opposed to like 30, when they were supposed to take on being a man and kind of creating their own household and stuff. One thing that I thought was interesting, you referenced this, of it appears that Augustus kind of shifted people's like understanding of like marriage and divorce, some of those things, and he had his reasons for doing it. But another influence was that we think of like, oh, Christian thought, maybe it influenced, like when Jesus came into the world, everything changed because of that. But there seemed to be an influence of Stoic like philosophy as well, that I had a hard time like dating exactly where all these references would be. But the thought there was that it was almost like, you know what, maybe life would be good if you had friendship in your marriage as well. That it wasn't just, hey, let's get together because this is our civic duty and we need to create more people in the world. But maybe there could be some happiness if we were friends with one another, which
that would be
sounds
good.
so foreign to us
That's
because it's like, no, that's the basis.
That's the core reason you get married.
Yeah. Is for love and to have your soulmate and this companionship. And then it's like, oh, do we want to have kids? Like, which is opposite of what they prioritize there.
The
but
primary
there seems
purpose
to be,
was to have children.
yeah.
And that's a practical reason. That sounds demeaning, I think, in some ways, but even throughout biblical history, even in ancient Near Eastern history, it's very important to have children because you have to have an inheritance, somebody to carry on, people to work around the house. It's just more practical than what we generally think about. And we'll talk about children here in a little bit. It couldn't be any more different than modern day society. And this is why I caution people, and sometimes I'm made too abrasive about it, but you cannot have modern day marriage and parenting classes based on the Bible and compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. It just does not compute. There's not that much said about parenting in the scriptures because it just really wasn't as complicated as today. Children were not elevated onto these ivory pedestals like we put in today, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But one of the things that you mentioned, we do think about arranged marriage, and of course that goes on. I think really probably most marriages that we can think about in the world may be very well arranged, but that's not all strange and unusual even to Western history. When you think about it in the Middle Ages or even in feudal Japan or wherever it winds up, and maybe even today in many societies, because there's also an element of honor, and we've talked about honor and shame. Well, we're not going to do a marriage that's going to bring down our family's social standing. We're going to have a marriage that elevates perhaps both parties' social standing, brings honor to the family. We're probably not going to marry across as romantic as some of the movies like try to make this out to be. Marrying above or below your social class probably wasn't common, and doing it just because of how their society was. And so, but I would think you're right to mention it doesn't mean it's just completely dry. It doesn't mean that they hated each other, but there may not have been a 4 or 5 years of dating before you got married and a whole lot of discussion about some of the things you talked about.
Yeah. One thing that I thought was interesting in some of the stuff I read is that there seems to be some similarities between like Roman and Greek marriages and what we would think of marriages of the Jews as well. Mm-hmm. Is that you had this betrothal. Yeah.
Engagement.
Cannot say that word. Yes. Engagement. Yeah. Trying to say the word that they said, but that both of them had that as like a two-stage thing. You would have that. You would have the wedding. You would also have the family's contract being involved in that. Both of that was there, and you referenced the reasons for some of those things as well. For some of the Romans, you did have the dowry that was involved as well, which would be this payment that would be agreed upon. There would be witnesses from both sides of this agreement. Because when you think about it, when money gets involved in things, like
you better put it in writing.
Yeah, you better put it in writing. So they would have some of that. And one thing that I thought was interesting is that it seemed for the Romans that a wife could file for divorce or declare. It kind of changed with Augustus, but it was kind of very informal before him, became a little bit more formal where you actually had to like put it in writing, but that a wife could leave and take her dowry back. So like she had some type of negotiation there, like, because if she left, that money and stuff would go with her and stuff was there. So I thought that was kind of interesting as well there.
Well, for Jewish marriage, if they followed Torah, which they probably did, then there's a bride price paid, and then there's also a dowry of sorts that's brought over. And if you divorce a man's daughter, you pay some penalty back to him because you're bringing back to that father a non-virgin daughter who he's got to feed and can probably never marry off again. And so there's a penalty for divorce. And like you said, I think I read during the Roman Republic, and maybe it persisted in the New Testament era in the imperial times, You could divorce by just sitting across from your spouse and you saying, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you 3 times, and you're divorced. Because only Roman citizens had a legal marriage in the Roman court system. Mm-hmm. Everybody else just married according to their own local customs or their religious beliefs or whatever it might end up being. And then that religion could be dissolved by their religious belief, kind of like Jesus deals with when he deals with Jews, talking about, why can a man divorce a woman because she burnt the toast, or does it have to be adultery? And so that obviously was a Jewish issue. The Romans didn't care. And we know that Roman citizens were afforded a whole lot of different rights.
This is more focused on like the upper class, but that's, where a lot of our information comes from. But the legitimacy of a marriage mattered to the Romans, but it was more based upon the wealth. Like the family name could be passed down, but only if it was a legitimate child, and then only legitimate children could inherit the father's estate. So you may have some children being born like outside the family or the marriage, maybe, yeah. But they would not have equal rights mm-hmm. that the children within that marriage would have as well. And one thing that I thought Augustus was kind of trying to change, he made a couple laws to try to bring about some stability like in the world and culture. And his laws tried to regulate marriage, but it wasn't because he was trying to be moral, but he was trying to impact the birth rate and also trying to just create some stability. Because if you think about it, like there's a lot of goodness when we think about marriage and what that does for like the home and children and all that. But like those things are also functional for society. Because if you have men and women going around just having children with random people, like you got a lot more people that are not being taken care of, they didn't value children. So mm-hmm. It brings upon a lot of problems to a culture or society as well. So you see some regulation there on some of that, but it's not because they're trying to be godly. They're just trying to be practical.
That's right. Well, he did the same thing when too many people were freeing slaves. He was like, hey, let's slow down on freeing slaves too much because they enter into society, and where do we place them? How do we deal with them? And like you're saying, people that have a whole lot of children outside of being married, and that somebody's got to feed them. They got to be taken care of. They don't have an inheritance. The real practical reason, Jews weren't the only people who outlawed adultery. It wasn't as if the ancient Babylonians and other people mm-hmm. condoned adultery. For the main reason is it really messes up inheritance issues. Okay, who has the right to the inheritance? When you have illegitimate children out there from the dad, from the father, you got to deal with that. But what about when a woman has a child by another man and he's born and the father doesn't know if he's the father of that child or not? That really messes up inheritance issues. Yeah. And so, not to be ugly, but that really is. Yeah. Adultery is not just an ethical and moral issue. It's all a very practical issue.
And with divorce as well, he tried to control some of that as well. As if you got divorced, there were some limitations on what you can receive from your inheritance, from like your father and stuff, to try to limit some of that chaos there. So, all right, let's talk about children. Tim, you referenced that earlier, but we kind of wanted to wrap up marriage there.
Yeah, we want to understand that children were of a different social status and very, very low. I often say it's children and slaves and livestock at the bottom end of the social ladder. And it's not because they didn't care about their children or didn't love their children. They're just more sensible, really, about children than we are. They did not have models of development and these charts and stages of development that they were checking boxes off of and marking through as their children were raised up. Children did not have an opinion. Nobody cared about their worldview. And that's really true because they don't know things that to be able to add to the wisdom of the family. We see them mistreated by Jesus. We say treated normally by Jesus' disciples by like, hey, the rabbi can't be bothered with you. And Jesus asked them to let the children come to him. And he teaches an object lesson using those children of their low humility. And they're humble because they have to be. They are very, very low on the ladder, like servants. And Jesus says people like these need to inherit the kingdom of heaven. Now, preachers have taken that way beyond, I think, what the text would ever understood, and say they're innocent and they're humble and they rely on other people for everything, which is true, and maybe that's the case. But they weren't being rude to the children. They were treating the children like they would probably expect to be treated. their value in a household they didn't have special privilege just because they've been born in the world. What are they contributing to the whole? And you alluded to this earlier. Children who had birth defects under Roman law were strongly encouraged for parents to leave them out exposed or to let them die. Sometimes daughters weren't valued as much as male children were valued.
Yeah, one thing I read was that you really didn't want more than one daughter because
that's right. You got to provide a dowry for
yeah.
them. And so there's economic.
And they didn't carry on the name and, like
didn't
the honor that you wanted to be passed on. Yeah.
Didn't have the same legal rights. That's right. And that sounds horrible to us, but we're just not that far removed from that in some cultures in our society today. In the way they look, they only had so much to go around. There's not, we talked about limited resources here. There really were limited resources, and how many mouths you could feed was important.
How did life expectancy? I cannot speak today.
Expectancy. How long was people supposed to live? Now, one of the things
how did that impact?
Yeah, we should have kind of talked about this earlier, but keep in mind, from our perspective, these people lived a very accelerated life because there's not a realistic expectation like you and I have to live into our 80s and 90s. I don't know that we're going to live that long, but I think in general we plan for it. We do retirement planning. Mm-hmm. Things have to come on and happen. You're going to have children in your teenage years because many of them, I've seen different rates, but around 30 to 35% infant mortality rate. And we think that sounds crazy high, but in a world without NICUs and without medicine and without surgery and without antibiotics, think about how many children would not survive in the United States today. Also, many women died in childbirth. That's one of the reasons they tried to give children young, because, to be frank, younger women can have babies healthier and have healthier, lower risk childbirth. But I understand too in several resources that only about 50% of children live to see their 10th birthday. So, like you said earlier, if you want to have a son to inherit something, you may want to have 2 or 3 of them, because the chances, if you only have one, like me, I'm my only child, there's a 50-50 shot I'm even going to make it to near adulthood, because about 12 years old was pretty much adulthood. There's a pretty slim chance just because I'm going to get a cut that's going to get infected. There's all kinds of things. I could get some kind of disease that today we can cure with one trip to the doctor office, but I can't cure it in that day and time. And so when we think about children, one of the reasons I've heard that people didn't tend to be as attached to their children as we are today is because we do expect our children to outlive us. For them, from maybe an emotional and psychological point of view, they may not have wanted to get too attached to their children because there's not an expectation that they certainly are going to live longer than us or they're going to live to adulthood. I don't think it means they didn't love their children. I think they love their children just like we love their children. I think mothers would throw themselves in front of a chariot to save their children. Not saying that, but in the reality of it is they are burdensome when they're young. Children took on a lot of responsibility a lot earlier in life. When they were 12, 13 years old, they're doing daddy's business. They're working. They're taking care of the household. I know today people say children are psychologically incapable of doing things and taking on responsibility in their mid-teens, but the bulk of human history argues against that. We had 16-year-old kids, 15, 16-year-old kids fighting in the American War for Independence. There's just a different – I don't want us to look down on these people, but Tim, they just didn't value children the same because of just the nature of the business.
Yeah. Would it be a better framework maybe for us to think about this is that it's not like they didn't love them, but their lives did not be dictated by what their children wanted to do and all their activities and stuff like that, to where that's really, it's not like they didn't love their kids, but they didn't control or dominate what the family would be doing.
That's the biggest difference between today. Children were not the priority in the family. Having children was a priority for very, very practical reasons, but children were not the priority. They did not dominate the decision-making. And for the bulk of humans on this planet, they don't. It's really only in some Western cultures where children have been elevated to everything in the family revolves around them and their well-being and their education. These children, most children of common people, there's not a concept of education outside the household. We see wealthier people, they may have a slave like a paidagogos, it's translated guardian in Galatians 3 and 4, that may teach them manners and things like it. But you got to have a wealthy enough person that has a slave that tends after children. but they weren't necessarily their educator. They may have taken them to a place of education where they learned rhetoric and reading and writing and whatever they had to learn. But for most people, that wasn't a reality. And so I think you're 100% right. And let's be sure that the world did not revolve around the children's needs and wants like it does for many Americans today.
Yeah, but they wanted somebody
and I'm not advocating we go back to children don't matter. I'm saying, but when we study Scripture, we need to realize that it is not through the lens of modern day parenting. To do so is to teach falsely.
Yeah, it seems like they did value, though, having that son that could pass on their name. Right. And that was very important. We see that in the Old Testament as well, but still a very important thing here.
And that's important in societies today.
Yeah. All right, let's move to our last category here when we think about the household codes. What are those, Tim? Like, define that. That may be a term people have heard before, but kind of define it and walk us through what those categories are.
Yeah, they may have seen Haustafel in a commentary, which is the German word for household codes, I think.
Probably not, but
probably not, but maybe not. Depending on if they're reading quality commentaries there. Primarily, I broke it down in a few different sections, and our listeners can read these. We're not going to develop all of these, but to read them. Ephesians 5, verse 22 through chapter 6, verse 9, and Colossians 3, 18 through 25. Of course, those two are often called sister letters to one another. They deal with men and women. Of course, it's translated husband and wife, and I think it's accurately translated husband, wife. Our listeners need to know there's no such separate word for husband or man in the Greek language. They're both the same word. But children are dealt with there, and also slaves and master relationships are dealt with. So some pretty broad household codes. And we call them that because they're regulated households. And one of the things that we look at as we go through these things is I think it's a mistake to say that these are a Christian invention in their entirety. There are things in there that I think would have been very honorable duties for men and women and masters and slaves and children to do that would have been looked at as their duty and honorable in their surrounding society. Paul adds in, because everything, and Peter, we'll talk about in just a second, adds in a different element. We're going to do these things, and let me give you a different comparison, because Christ is the head of the church. You know, when we think about male headship in the family, well, Romans didn't obviously think about that, but they did look at a male as being mostly the head of the family, a very male-dominated society. Not that every woman was barefoot and pregnant type mentality. There were many women who were prominent business owners, and thankfully we have some that probably let the church meet in their house, and like Lydia is a good example we think about. But these regulations, I think, were taught for the same reason he says to honor the emperor and to abide by laws and just not be troublemakers, because we're not going to do anything that's going to bring dishonor upon the Christian people. We're going to have enough of that in the coming centuries. And I think the Holy Spirit at least knew that, if Paul didn't know that. In the coming centuries, especially in the 3rd century and the 2nd century, Christians are going to be ridiculed. They're going to be ostracized. They're eventually going to be persecuted in organized imperial persecutions in the 3rd century. We're to behave honorably in society. And to fulfill your role in society is a thing of honor to do that, whether it's bearing children or what else. Peter in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, he talks about husbands and wives relationships. Again, we see this couched within Christianity. Titus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, we see some really terrific lessons and directions. Greg say, hey, older men, older women, I need you to teach the younger men and younger women how to behave, and then here's how you're supposed to behave, older men and older women. Younger men, younger women, here's how you're supposed to behave. And he also deals with slaves in that passage. And we've talked about slavery already in our previous podcast.
So of those categories there, what teaching here that we see in Scripture would maybe be most counterculture? Because we see a redefining.
Counter to American culture? Or
no, to their
culture.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, masters, maybe there are some masters who did not treat their slaves well. We talked about abuse did exist in that way, but now it's kind of like Paul's letter to Philemon about Onesimus. Yeah, you could beat the stew out of him when he gets back because he ran away illegally, and you're well within your rights to do so. And I know it was a financial burden on you. Paul even offers to make up that money. If he's wronged you somehow, I put it on my tab, he says. I think that masters treating their slaves in a certain way with more dignity but still they're the masters. And in slaves obeying their masters and adding a caveat to that of not rebelling against them. I don't know that, I think that would uphold probably things in society. I'm not so sure it'd be revolutionary. A lot of philosophers were, debating whether slavery was moral and ethical. I'm talking about outside Christianity.
See, one thing
obviously the concept of Christ being the head of some church and that being a metaphorical comparison to husband-wife relationship would have been strange and unusual. But
but when it comes to the home, because
I don't know.
I'm not an expert, and that's why I always get the feel that we talked about this a little bit earlier, that, there's this developing idea of more like friendship in the marriage and stuff like that. But it seems to be that call for husbands to sacrifice, like Christ sacrificed for the church, seems in my mind to not be what was commonly held there. But I didn't know what you thought. I'm not an expert on that. Not that the husband had a free reign to mistreat her, but that he would really put her needs above his seems to be foreign for what I understand of Roman culture and stuff like that.
That makes sense. I think it would be applicable in Jewish culture too. When I think about things that maybe societies, if it's Roman, if it's Greek, meaning kind of the center of the Roman Empire, Asia Minor, Greece, and then Palestine, I think you would see the Jewish probably male headship, male domination of the family, a real patriarchal system was probably more the case than maybe you might see if you moved west. I'm not saying that they weren't patriarchal with the head of the family or anything, but I'm talking about, we think about what we might today call old-fashioned. I might say, or traditional. I would say that probably Jewish households were way more traditional towards male headship. But if, in fact, I don't think Roman society encouraged male abuse of their wives or anything along those lines. I don't know we got any evidence of that. But, I mean, I'm sure it existed. We don't encourage male abuse of women today.
And I didn't mean that, but I meant of the fully sacrificing.
For them, I think that probably you're probably right. I think that might be foreign to think about in that concept, and using Christ's relationship with the church as that example, because Christ is not an abusive and domineering authority over the church. He's a loving and caring and sacrificial and servant-based authority over the church, but he's still an authority. He is still the headship, and he's actually given that authority in individual congregations over to men to lead. And so, I think you're probably right. I think it's a pretty good statement to think through that may be a little revolutionary to think, and maybe even for some women, depending on where this was read, and we think about in Ephesus or Colossae, we're talking about it in Asia, in a very probably Greek world. I think Ephesus was even founded as a Greek colony hundreds of years before that. Women may have been advancing. Some people make this argument about when he writes to Timothy about women's roles in 1 Timothy 2, but they may have been becoming something in a family challenging male leadership. And so some may think that maybe not Paul was putting them in their place, but saying, hey, maintain that honorable role that you have, and then using the comparison of the church being subjected to Christ, that would be new. But I think there's legitimacy to what you're saying. I love these household codes from the fact of I truly believe there are Paul and Peter instructing people to do what is honorable in society, and to do it even more so because now you're Christians. You're masters, I want you to treat your slaves, and slaves, I want you to be peaceable with one another and get along and do your duty, not only because it's a Roman rule, but because it's what Christ would like for you to do. We're not going to be troublemakers in this society. I don't know anywhere where Christians are called to be troublemakers in society and draw negative attention to themselves any more than they already had.
Yeah, and I think that is a consistent, not just in these, but a consistent teaching throughout the New Testament, that you do need to be mindful of how you're perceived by outsiders, because you want to be seen as respectable and loving and honorable, for the name of Jesus, so.
Well, we think about it. I said this the other night in class, and I sit in an island all by myself. I told you on this right here amongst restorationists, but I'm a pretty firm believer that elders were to be, people who were eligible to be elders in the Lord's church were to be honorable men in their society, respected by those outside, that men that fulfilled their duty. And I believe their children had to be trustworthy. I believe their children had to be obedient children that weren't rebelling against their parents, that if they did have a paterfamilias over the family, they honored the head of the family, they did what they asked them to do, because otherwise that would have been viewed as shameful.
Yeah.
And a person managing his household. When you say that, we think about the nuclear family, but I think in many places we would see that's also speaking of the extended family and even adult children. I know most of the time we read that verse I just mentioned that they have to be baptized. I don't know that I'm certain about that. I know that they had to be honorable children, and the elder had to be respected amongst this community. I think it's very important so the church did not have a bad name, and that they could manage that household. Would have been a tremendous task if we're talking about an extended household of slaves and freed persons and adult children and young children. It would have been very challenging. But I may be strange and unusual in that belief. I probably am, but that's the case.
Well, you're definitely strange and unusual. That's for sure.
I'm still good looking.
Yeah, you have the face for TV. So.
That's right. No, that's supposed to be the face for
I know, podcast.
The face for podcast.
All right. Anything else before we wrap up here, Tim?
No, I think, we obviously could spend an entire episode or more than one episode on all of these things. We've talked about some resources people can read on these. The number one message is we want people to interpret the Bible in its original context. I am a historical grammatical interpreter. I know not everybody agrees with that way to interpret the Bible, and to each his own. But I think it's a mistake when we don't study these things in the Bible and make our interpretation in its original context. And then think, what are the principles that are taught there? Even we talk about male headship. Okay, that's a principle that's taught. Okay, how do we make that work in the United States? How do we make it work in South Africa? How do we make it work in India? How do we make it work in Iceland? Wherever we go with mission work in El Salvador, how do we make that work and get it to work within the framework of the society we're dealing with, because it is different everywhere we go. Yep. But the principles can be foundational.
Yeah. And I think this pursuit is important for all believers to pursue that knowledge, and step by step it will help you better be interpreters and understanding of Scripture, and help you bring that message forward into your world and your family and your interactions with all people.
Don't be afraid of a little bit of work in interpreting the Bible.
Yeah, very true. If you got questions or suggestions for future topics, let us know by emailing us at podcast@mountjuliet.org. To our fellow students of Scripture, thank you for joining us for Tech Support. We hope you will join us next week.
This is a podcast of the Mount Juliet Church of Christ. You can find more personal growth resources like this one at mountjuliet.org/resources. The Mount Juliet Church of Christ exists to glorify God and make disciples by helping people grow in Christ, love one another, and serve others.